how we can manage the cover crops to suppress the weeds. So before we learn about the weeds, let's talk briefly about the pest. So pest, what is a pest? So pest is a living organisms that is a nuisance or causes a damage or interfere with the desirable plants in our fields or landscapes, orchards. It also impacts the human and the animal health. And some examples of pests includes weeds, insects, mites, rodents, bacteria, and the fungi. So weed is a class within the pest. So what are weeds now? So simply put, weed is a plant that is growing out of place or in the place where it is not desired. In the common example of plants growing out of place, such as grass growing in a flower bed, or if we can say the soybean plant growing on a golf green would be a weed. So whenever we see the plant which is not desired, and mostly those are unwanted plants, so those are named as weeds. Weeds tend to be plants that are adaptive and competitive in a range of environmental conditions, and there are approximately 250,000 species of plants worldwide. And out of those, 3% or 8,000 species behave as weeds. And out of 8,000 species, only 200 to 250 are major problems in the worldwide cropping systems. And we possess one or more of these characteristics that allow them to survive and increase in nature. See, abundant seed production, they have capacity to do that. They can produce tens or hundreds of thousands of seeds per plant. However, most plants, our crop plants, they can produce several tens seeds per plant. And most weeds, they can germinate and become established relatively quickly. They also produce the viable seeds even under the environmental and soil conditions that are not favorable for most crop plants. The next is the dormancy. Dormancy is basically a resting stage or a temporary stage in which the weed seeds, they do not germinate. And it can be induced in many weed seeds, even when a crop canopy filters the sunlight, shade the ground, and that reduces the germination of the weed seeds. Weeds, they do have the long-term survival if they're buried. If the conditions are adequate, the buried weed seeds have the potential to remain viable for more than 40 years. And the broadleaf weed seeds, they tend to last longer in the soil than the grassy since they have the tougher seed coats. And they have the special adaptation for the spread, special adaptation for the spread. They have certain mechanisms for easy dispersal of seeds, which include structures, they can fly or float. They do have the capacity for the vegetative reproductive structures, and that helps them to reproduce, such as for the perennial weeds, they have the special structures such as rhizomes, tubers, stolons, roots, and that allow them to reproduce and survive for long periods of time. And lastly, when a site is disturbed, weeds are usually the first one to emerge. Okay, so now we know weeds, their characteristics. The weeds are very competitive, as we all know, and they compete with the crop plants for valuable resources such as light, nutrients, water, space, and then they can reduce the crop yields or the quality, especially if the crop seeds, they get contaminated with the weed seeds. They also increase the cost of production by increasing the cost of labor, herbicide costs, their application, time, etc. And some weeds, they may harbor crop insects, the pests or pathogens. And when weeds have a significant negative impact, they can reduce the economic value of the agricultural land. Weeds can increase the soil erosion since many weeds, they do not hold the soil in place. Weeds can negatively impact the recreation areas as well, making it impossible to get to the water bodies or other recreational sites. In addition, they can also exude the inhibitors from the roots, which reduce the growth of the crop plants. So this is just an image of one of our experiment station. When I started, you can see how dense the weed population is. And I will discuss more about this, the winter cover crop, and this is all the weeds on the other side. So we'll discuss those in the later slides. Okay, so now we know weeds are very competitive. So how we can manage those? The weed management plan always work best when there is more than one control method used in the plan. And the programs or the plans that rely solely on the herbicides are not necessarily effective. And the best approach to effective weed control is called the integrated weed management, which considers the weeds involved, their severity of infestation, and then looks at all the control methods available to combat the weed infestation. And these strategies are not limited to chemical control, but they also include the biological, mechanical, which is physical. Then we have the cultural, which we will be learning shortly. Then we do have the sanitation and the prevention practices. Again, the single control technique is really sufficient to control the weeds. So we'll learn briefly about these practices before we learn more about the cover crops. So the chemical weed control, it all involves the use of the herbicides, as we all know, and they help to suppress the weeds or kill the weeds. For many decades, herbicides have been the primary means of weed management due to their simplicity, effectiveness, and affordability. But at the same time, they do cost money. It costs money to purchase them, to buy the equipment necessary, to apply them, and then to pay for the time involved in their application process. So they do cost us, right? And the herbicide rate and the application timing are always important factors to consider when using the herbicides. And there are many different herbicides available. So some knowledge about how particular herbicides work is necessary before applying any herbicides to combat the weeds. So this is a herbicide treadmill that I just created. This is a situation that can arise when herbicides are used repeatedly. So first we have the crops infested with the weeds, then we apply the herbicides and everything seems okay. We got a good fields. But then some of the weeds are naturally resistant to the herbicides and they survive, they reproduce and result in more weed problems. Then we apply more herbicides and then the resistance of weeds not sensitive to the control occurs and then the problem even gets worse. So then we have more herbicides are used at higher rates and more frequently, and then the problem continues to get worse. So what is the outcome? The outcome of this treadmill is ineffective weed control, and then we have more herbicide-resistant weeds on the ground. So the most effective long-term way to manage the weeds is by using the combination of methods that work better together when they are used each separately. So when talking about the integrated weed management, it is common to describe the tools in terms of a pyramid. The major emphasis is on the base of the pyramid, which lists prevention or the sanitation. And then the top is at the chemical, which involves use of pesticides, minimum use of the pesticides. So herbicides alone cannot adequately manage the herbicide-resistant weeds. The integration with the other methods is essential, and use of integrated methods helps avoid the herbicide treadmill too. So the next is the prevention, which was at the base of the pyramid. And sanitation and prevention are always the most cost-effective strategies. Clean up the problems and don't try to ensure that you are not introducing the problems. So such as always plant certified weed-free seed, clean the equipments before moving from one field to the another field, such as many weed seeds, such as the puncture vine seeds, they stuck to the tire. And when we travel the equipment from one field to the other, we are sowing their seeds themselves in the next field. And this is the image showing the combine. The back end of the combine shows how easily plant materials are lodged. And when we move to the next field, we'll definitely having some weed seeds in there. We will be planting those along the crop. The next methodology is the mechanical or the physical control strategies, and they involve reducing the pest infestation by disrupting the pest or providing a physical barrier to prevent the pest from infesting an area. They do involve the actions such as tillage, mulching, pulling the weeds out, mowing, burning, or otherwise anything physically disrupting the life cycle of a weed. The mechanical control by pulling or digging up the weeds can be very effective control method too for the small infested areas. The burning can be a good control method for certain weeds, but it comes with its own set of potential problems, such as wildfire or damage to the desirable vegetation. The mowing and burning, they can provide the short-term results. But along with the tillage, we do have uh, other we will be losing the soil carbon as well. And also we have the erosion as shown in this image. So we have the benefits and then we have the disadvantages at the same time. So we just need to consider those factors that we are not losing the quality of the soil. This is another field that I'm working on. It's a squash project and we do have the plastic mulch on the top and it's helping immensely with the weed pressure. So mulch is a good one of the effort too. The another approach is a biological control method where we are using the living organisms such as livestock, insects, predators, parasites, pathogens to control the weeds. But the results are not immediate. And as with all control methods, there are some issues to be considered. The one is the effectiveness. So many biological controls, they do not eradicate the weeds. They just nimble around the edges of the infestation. Then the selectivity is the another issue. Sometimes a biological control is introduced to combat the weed infestation, but then the animal or the disease, they choose another non-target plant to attack. And then the reproduction, many biological controls are introduced, but they do not stay in place and they do not reproduce over time. For example, the ladybug or ladybird beetles, they can be introduced to control aphids, but then they fly off to the cooler climate when the weather gets hot. So the another consideration is the adaptation. The animals introduced must be adapted to the areas where they are being introduced. If not, they will not survive to reproduce and will not be self-perpetuating. So this is the one we will be focusing on from here onwards, the cultural practice, the cultural weed management. These are the practices that farmers can do to help the crop to be more competitive against the weeds. This includes practices that involve managing the plants that you are most interested in or you planted the seed in, and then make it as difficult as possible for weeds to be successful. It does include practices such as crop rotation, which also helps to break the pest life cycle. And diversity is the key for any agriculture system. So if we have focusing on the crop rotation, we'll better manage the ground. Then we do have the cover crops as one of the cultural practice, planting date, adjusting the seeding rate, and then reducing the row spacing. Then we do have the soil fertility. And these methods are just used to produce a healthy crop that can effectively compete with the weeds. And these most are the agronomic best practices that will help us to produce a healthy crop. Okay, so let's talk about the cover crops. And what are the cover crops? It can be any type of the plant that just covers the soil. So it helps to reduce the brown grabs, mostly the fallow periods, especially during the winter or the summer fallow periods. They do help with competing with the weeds during the periods when the cash crops are not grown, thereby suppressing the growth and seed production of the weeds that otherwise could replenish their seed banks. The cover crops are green manures when a grower turns them into the soil to provide the organic matter and the nutrients. And thus they can help in improving the soil. So it's an excellent option too, in addition to the other benefits that we'll be talking about next slide. It can be used in any piece of any size, ranging from the garden to the large farm to the open fields. So why we need the cover crops? The cover crops are like a Swiss Army knife because of their dynamic utility on the farm. By planting and managing the cover crops, it not only helped to disrupt the disease cycle or suppress the weed growth, but growers can see multiple benefits to their piece of land, including soil health, increased yields with the improvement in the soil health, Then we have the reduced soil compaction. Then we do have the decreased soil erosion and improve infiltrations, rainfall infiltration, increase the pollinators and the beneficial insects, and improve the nutrient cycling. Legumes does help with fixing the nitrogen in the soil. And with all those benefits, when we see in a long term, there would be some economic returns, increase in the economic returns by saving the money spent on the inputs or increasing the crop yields. So the types of the cover crops. So many plant species can be used as a cover crops. The legumes, grasses, including the cereals, they are the most extensively used, but there is increasing interest in the brassicas, such as rapeseed, mustard, radish, and also in the summer broadleaf, such as the buckwheat, millets. Uh, it can include anything, and we can have annuals, biennials, or the perennials can be used as a cover crops. Annuals which complete their life cycle in a season. Then we have the biennials which take 2 years or more than a year. Then we have the perennials which can stay for 4 to 5 years. So cover crop, it can be it depends upon the objectives, and it can be during for a short term or a long term. So let's talk about the grasses. So grasses, they are usually the quick growing. They have the fibrous root systems, are very useful for scavenging the nutrients, especially nitrogen, which is left over from the previous crop. In addition, they can, as I mentioned, they can establish rapidly, and they can produce large amount of residues above and below ground. The above ground residue can help suppress the weed germination and also the growth. And then we can have cool season and the warm season grasses, including the cereals, depending upon the time you want to seed the cover crop in. The cool season will be seeded in the fall, about 30 to 40 days before the killing frost, and they will survive the winter. Depending upon the time of the seeding, some growth will occur in the fall and then early spring before they will grow more in the early spring before you can incorporate into the ground. Then we do have the summer annuals or the summer crops. They are seeded in the spring or the early summer, and they grow until the end of the season, and most will die over the winters. So these are just some of the examples into the each categories, depending upon the period or the time you are interested to seed the crop in. So this is the tuff that I planted. It's an excellent summer cover crop too. And this is another grass variety. Okay, so the other one, other than the grasses, including the cereals, there is a broadleaf plants, which are the plants with the leaves that have a flat and relatively broad surface. And this surface is often marked with a network of prominent veins. And they're fast growing too. They bring up the nutrients from the deeper soils and then make it upon decomposition, which help the nutrient cycling. As with the grasses, they are similar. They can be grown in the warm season and the cool season, depending upon the time of the year you are interested in, or when the fields are fallow or after vegetable harvest of the vegetable crop. In the warm, we can include the buckwheat, sunflower, and safflower, and in the cool, it can be mustards, rapeseed, radish, turnip. These can be incorporated into seeded into the soil. This is another cool one, the camelina, that I would be demonstrating into the share some findings that I have actually worked with. And it's not only a cover crop, it's a cash cover crop, and the seed from this can be harvested, and then we can get the oil out of it, which can be used as a food and the feed. The next category of the cover crops is the legumes, and plants in the legume family, they grow in cooperation with the soil dwelling bacteria, and these bacteria, they live in the nodules on the roots of the legumes, and they take the nitrogen gas from the air, and then they convert it into the farm plants, and they add it to the soil. So legumes, they do help with fixing the nitrogen in the soil. But we do need to inoculate with the appropriate rhizobium at the seeding, so that we can improve the germination and help for more nitrogen fixation. Once the legumes done, then they die and its root begins to decompose. The residual nitrogen in the nodules, they become available to the other plants. And with the nitrogen fixation, it helps to replace or reduce the need of the nitrogen for the next crop in rotation. Again, they can be cool season and they can be warm season depending upon the season you are interested in. And with the veg clovers and then the winter peas, they can fix about 100 pounds of nitrogen an acre, but the other can fix less, but they do help with fixing the nitrogen into the soil. This is the soybeans that I had trials here at the Nevada too, so it performed pretty well. Then this is the other beans variety that I did some research in the previous years. In addition to that, in some cases, cover crop mixtures may be better than the individual cover crops, but the decision whether to mix species or plant a single species as a cover crop, it depends upon your goals and the time of the year and the associated cost. They do increase the biodiversity when we have mixes, and they can also provide us the mutual benefits. For instance, the legume has to supply more nitrogen or fix the nitrogen to the soil, which can be available to the subsequent crop. And grasses are better at erosion, and they can produce more residue and helps to combat the weeds. So if someone is interested to try mixes, it's always good to start with those as well. You can make your own blend or you can purchase the commercial mixes. I just added this cover crop chart here because I believe it's very informational. It is developed by the USDA and RCS, and they develop the cover crop chart depending upon the growth cycle you are interested in. It can be annual, biennial, perennial. They do have the cool season options, the warm season options, grasses, broadleaves, legumes, and then it also tells you about their water use, if they have the low, medium, or the high water requirements, or the usage, then also depends upon the plant architecture, if you want upright or the prostrate. So it would be good if you just look the cover crop USDA chart, it will pop up and you can decide based upon your needs. Okay, so next, let's learn about the how cover crops, they can suppress the weeds. The cover crops, they can suppress the weeds in a multiple ways that affect the specific stages of an annual weed's life cycle. It starts from we have the seed bank, then goes with the germination. Then we have the white thread stage, which is when you can't see the most of the leaves, but the seed looks like a white string in the ground. Then we have the seedling stage, vegetative growth, and then again the seed production, which leaves the seed into putting the seed bank. So it's mostly for the annual weeds cycle that how we as cover crops can help to suppress the annual weeds. So here is a list of the tactics that how cover crops suppress the weeds. If we look at these stages, the seed bank and the germination, the factors of the parameters of the cover crops that has to suppress the weeds at these stages are the microenvironment and the natural enemies. The cover crops, they do as a leaving or a mulch, they do alter the soil moisture and the temperature environment in the soil surface. So living cover crops or a layer of cover crop as a residue, they do reduce the sunlight reaching the soil surface. And this does help with reducing the weed seed germination and also the survival of the weed seeds in the seed bank. The natural enemies, the cover crops, they may harbor predators such as ants, rodents, crickets, ground beetles, predators of the weed seeds or the pathogens that reduce or inhibit the weed growth. However, the population of the predators can be increased in addition to including the cover crop into the system by reducing the pesticide use or reducing the tillage practices. So starting from the germination until to the seed production, the other factors that influence that suppresses the weeds are physical suppression. So how cover crops, they help reducing the weed growth and the germination. So the mulch layer is created either by the killed cover crop, which interferes with the germination and also the establishment of the weeds. It's especially effective against the small seeded weed seeds. And then the another important characteristics of the cover crop is the allelopathy, which means that the some cover crop species, for instance, the cereal rye, it releases the chemicals from the roots or decaying residue, which can inhibit the weed seed germination and growth, which is known as allelopathy. It means the chemicals released by the plants which inhibit the growth of the other plants. And the other crops such as Brassica family, the cover crops in the Brassica family, they do contain a number of compounds such as glucosinolates, which also affect the weed growth. The competition is another important characteristics of the cover crop, starting from the white thread stage until the seed production. As the cover crops, they do compete with the weeds for the resources, similar to what we learned before, that the weeds, they do compete with the cover crops. So they both compete with each other, thus interfere in the weed growth for all those resources listed here, in addition to the space too. And then the control, how the cover crop, when we tilled in or when we mowed the cover crop or rolled the cover crop or otherwise terminated, how cover crop at that stage, it helps with the suppressing the weed. So when we follow these practices, it interferes with the weed emergence and growth, especially when it occurs before the germination, emergence, or the seed production. So these are the important characteristics of the cover crop that help to suppress the weeds throughout for the entire life cycle of an annual weed, starting from the seed bank in the ground until the seed production. So these factors, they do influence at the various stages as listed here. And I really, this is from the Pennsylvania Suppressing Weeds Using Cover Crops. They did publish this. So it's a very good learning tool to go from here to. How we can manage the cover crops to suppress the weeds. So it's very important decision to choose the species, select the species based upon your objectives. If, for instance, if the weed suppression is an objective, as the title of this talk is, so select an aggressive species that will cover the ground quickly, and select the species that will work for you. Always consider the competitive power of the cover crops while leaving as a physical suppression or once terminated. So the species selection is most important and go from there. Then the next consideration is the establishment method and the time. The cover crops can be established by the conventional method, no tillage, broadcast seedings. However, the broadcast seeding is generally less successful, and the aerial seeding is another option to allow the cover crop to be established before the cash crop is harvested. So establishing a hardy winter cover, it is good to seed in as soon as possible in the fall after the harvest of the cash crop, which will result in more biomass over the winters and rapid growth during the summer, during the early spring. The another important consideration is the seeding rate and the row spacing. The seeding rate of the cover crop, it will influence the weed suppression. Planting it higher than the normal seeding rate or in the narrow row spacing, it can influence the amount of the soil cover, and especially during the first few weeks after the seeding. And always remember, the thick, dense cover crop stand can help reduce the establishment of the weeds. So it's very important to get the quickly established cover crops, have the more biomass. It will help to suppress the weeds. Then it is important to provide adequate soil fertility to cover crops to ensure that they are competitive and successful. But remember not to add too much as it's going to feed the weed seeds as well. So I would say the testing the soil and getting to know the status is a good starting point to know the soil nutrient status. The another important factor is the termination timing and method. So allow the cover crop to grow as long as possible to reduce the weed population, especially from competition through the competition with the weeds for the nutrients, light, moisture, and achieve the maximum dry matter production, which will also help to reduce the weed suppression. However, this may result in delaying the termination and the planting of the next cash crop. So it's important to think about the termination timing, your goals, and then the methods which we will be learning in the next slide. So other than those practices, some additional practices that good to consider for the cover crops to manage the weeds is never leave the land bare, always keep it covered. That will help to reduce the seed bank in the ground in the longer run, right? The another important thing is weed scouting. Identify the weed species that are present in the field that will gauge the effectiveness of a cover crop on those species. For instance, the annual weeds, they are easily suppressed compared to those with the perennial life cycle. So weed scouting is a good thing to start with. So depending upon that, your objectives go from there. Then the time of the year is when the cover crop is needed. It can be fall, it can be spring, or it can be summer, which is also dictated by the objectives. And always select a cover crop that's seasonally appropriate, as cool seasons crop would not work well for you during the summer, or the summer season crops would not work well for you in the cool season. So choose the crop that is best candidate for a given season. For example, the sorghum or the millets or the teff, they would work best during the summers. Excuse me. Then we have planting time. Here the main focus is to have as much biomass as possible that will help to reduce the weed, suppress the weeds, provide more soil coverage. So early planting of the cover crops will reduce the overall emergence of the weeds. Plant the cover crops early enough in the fall if the ground is bare, or as soon as possible after the harvest of the main crop. That will allow enough time for the sufficient biomass production. And again, that will help to provide the soil coverage and suppress the weeds. So early planting is a good just target for that. Look for the species that establish quickly and also produce a large amount of the biomass. The goal here is the direct competition. Cover crops needs to use the resources that would otherwise go towards the weed germination. So look for the species that can grow quickly, provide high biomass. And so for instance, this is one of the Clemson University images that shown here. Here's the cotton, and then they had a cereal rye. So you can see the entire cereal rye mulch on the ground between the cotton rows, and without the cover crop, you can see how big the weeds here are. So this clearly shows the biomass, have more of biomass on the ground that would help to suppress the weeds. And then cover crops can be planted in the mixtures or as a single species. But remember, if we have the mixtures, then they can provide you the mutual benefits. For instance, the legume can help to fix the nitrogen, and cereals, they are the aggressive, they grow, produce biomass quickly. So these are some of the additional practices that I think would be important for you to learn. Okay, other than that, the termination is very important because if we do not terminate in a timely manner, it can interfere with the cash crops. So before you plant, make sure that you know how you are going to terminate your cover crops. And they can be terminated with the herbicides or with the mechanical, using the practices such as mowing, tilling, or rolling with a roller crimper. The mowing can be effective control if it occurs after the flowering to prevent them from self-seeding. And if we do at the seeding stage, then it will become the weeds So make sure that you do it as soon as after the flowering and not allowing the plants to set the seeds. The tillage, it does control the cover, tillage controls the cover crops and incorporate the cover residue, the crop residues into the soil. This does speed up the degradation and release of the nutrients for the primary crop, but does not create a mulch layer since we are incorporating that into the ground. The another practice is a rolling with the roller crimper, which can effectively control some cover crops, especially when rolling occurs after the cover crop has begun to flower. It is most effective on the winter annuals once they begin flowering, but less effective on the legumes and not much effective on the perennials. And herbicides, as we all know, it is an effective control, can provide an effective control of the cover crops, but product selection and application timing are important. So make sure you consider those things before you start seeding the cover crop in. So these are some of the studies that I just put randomly demonstrating or sharing with you how the cover crops, they do help with the weed suppression. So I was actually involved with the studies while I was in Minnesota. And this is weed suppression with the winter camelina, which is one of the cash cover crop. They have been the Minnesota and other East people are working on, the collaborators are working on to develop as a cash cover crop. So this is a field that we planted after the sugar beet harvest. And for the growers involving with the sugar beet production, then after the harvest, about September, October, the ground is left bare. There is no cover on the ground until April, May, when they have the following spring crop in. So this bare soil, this leaves a lot of opportunities for the extensive weed growth, which you can see all these green patches. These are the weeds, and this is the camelina crop. This is on one of the growers' field that I was collaborating with. So obviously they are going to compete for the resources that I mentioned previously. So what we had here is, we had the 4 treatments here. We had camelina as a cover crop, winter cover crop. Then we had a herbicide dual, Magnum as a post. Then we had a camelina, no herbicide, no camelina, but we had herbicide. Then as a fellow, no camelina and no herbicide. Then what we found was interesting, that the percent cover of weed, which was assessed in the first week of July before the harvest of the camelina, the addition of the camelina along with the herbicide, the weed cover, the ground weed cover was only about 5%. However, when we had no camelina, but just the herbicide, it was about 20%. But when we had camelina without the herbicide, it was 12%. And in the fallow plots, we had about 44% of the ground cover with the weeds. So this clearly shows that winter camelina does inhibit the weeds as well or better than the metallochlor, which was used as a post-emergent, as there was no statistical difference between those treatments, and which tells the growers that including the camelina into the sugar beet cropping system increase the benefits, economic benefits, by reducing the need for applying the herbicides. So this was interesting, and you can clearly again see this is all camelina and this is all the weeds, and similar here, just the camelina and all those green plots are the weeds. So this was after the sugar beet, and clearly showing that the inclusion of the cover crop, especially on the bare ground, it does help with suppressing the weeds. And then, as I mentioned, with the brassicas, they do release a glucosinolates, and which also helps with the weed inhibition. So this is another study that was conducted in Nebraska on the rain-fed corn production in the wheat, corn, and the fallow system. So they had some cover crop species, and they also had a no cover crop as a fallow. They had the spring triticale, cereal rye, spring oat planted at 60 pounds an acre. Then they had some brassicas, kale, clovers at 20 pounds an acre. The hairy vetch was also included. And then the triticale, oat, turnip, kale, they died in the winter. However, the rye, vetch, clovers, they were terminated in the spring with the herbicide. And after this, they had a corn into the rotation. Since these were planted, after this, they had wheat in the rotation since it was planted after the corn. So yeah, so then they did, then they did at the wheat at the growth stage. I don't see which one, but in general, this was interesting to find that the cover crops inclusion into the rotation, they did reduce the wheat population. They did find that the cereal rye had the biggest impact on the wheat suppression. But again, the cereal rye did reduce the corn yield. So did reduce the wheat yield. So there was a concern among the growers that with the inclusion of the cereal rye and with the weediness potential of the cereal rye, what other alternatives can be available. So they did provide a triticale as the option to include in this rotation. That way they can reduce the cereal rye potential as a weed. It really goes very tall. I did had a cereal rye and it goes about 5-6 feet. It's a great for the erosion control as well. So this was just another study that I randomly found, and it's interesting to see that cover crops did reduce the wheat population. It was on the rain-fed corn production in the western Nebraska. This is another one that I thought it's interesting to share here. It's in the Kansas. They did had two sites, Colby and another HP ranch, and they had a VD check, which is fallow. They did had a spring pea, oat triticale, and three seed mix here. And after the inclusion of this as a cover crop into their system, they did find that the wheat biomass, it was about 1,800 pounds per acre when there was a field was fallow. However, when it was a spring pea, it was about less than 100 pounds an acre. And then again with the oat, triticale, and tree seed mix, it was statistically very significant reduction in the wheat biomass. At Colby, similar to the HB range, with the inclusion of the cover crops into the system, there was about more than 95% reduction into the into the weed biomass. There was a significant reduction in the suppress the weeds with the inclusion of the cover crops into their rotation as compared to the VD check. So this was all about about the cover crops, how we can manage and how they suppress the weeds, but how we can use the cover crops into our system. So they can be used as a winter cover crops when they can be planted after the harvesting of the cash crop or the vegetable crop, and allow them to have some growth before it is killed by the frost. And then in the next sprint, they will resume the growth, and then you can mow or turn in. Remember, the biomass, having the maximum biomass, more biomass will help with the weed suppression, but you mow or turn in before right at the flowering or to prevent them from setting the seed. Or you can have them as a summer crop, plant them in the early spring or early summer when the ground is bare. Even if you can also use them as a strip cropping, where you can plant the cover crops between the rows of the main crop. This will help to reduce the weeds and also reduce the compaction between the rows. So cover crops not only provide you the one benefit, there will be multiple benefits coming along with it. In addition to learning about the benefits, it's very important to know more considerations, more points that you have to think before including the cover crop. So there are potential benefits as you learn, but there are few disadvantages that may be minimized by the careful management. For instance, there is additional expenses, the cost associated with the cover crops that you have to spend on the seed cost and labor, then if there is a special equipment required for the planting or the harvesting. So there is some cost associated with the cover crops. Then along with that, there is a competition with the cash crops. Unmanaged or incompletely managed cover crops, they can behave like weeds, and they compete with the cash crops for water, light, nutrients, Even in the and also in the dry years, the cover crops may leave less water in the soil for the cash crops. So it is important to know based upon what your objectives are. And they also harbor the beneficial organisms, but they also harbor the pest. So good to know this too. And the termination time is also very important to consider. Remember, the more biomass you have, the more feed suppression, but again, you have to adjust the termination dates, and it might result in delaying the seeding of the next crop in the rotation. So with this, I would conclude that weed suppression is one of the many potential benefits of incorporating cover crops into the production system, as I show as a Swiss Army. And the successful use of the cover crops, they do require the proper selection of species dictated by your objectives and goals, then the timing of the seeding and the proper management practices. And plant the cover crops as soon as primary crop is harvested to capture many benefits, including the environmental, ecological, or the financial incentives in the long run. The biodiversity is the key. It always increases the success of most agriculture systems. And remember, the integrated weed management focuses on the long term. So always continue to access and focus on your goals and how do you want it to function in the future and what's the best way to get there. And then adjust your plan accordingly. And I think there is more research that needs to be done in this area. And key to success is experiment, and will that always provide you some more learning curves here. So always experiment, that would help to success. Some additional resources that I think would be useful. This is a technical note from the USDA NRCS Boise, Idaho about the cover crops for the Intermountain West. It has all the list of the cover crops. And then from the West, these manage weeds on your farms. Just additional resources that might be helpful in the short term. And thank you for your presence and listening and your attention. I really appreciate. And just acknowledging the funding opportunity here. It was supported by the USDA NIFA. With this, I will close and open up, take any questions. Again, I'm not a weed scientist, so I'm a crop specialist, but I will do my best to answer. Thank you.